Okay, well, firstly, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction and for this gathering today. Can I firstly start by acknowledging my great friend Keith Wallahan, who's probably the best friend of the Iranian Australian community in the Parliament, in my view. He's always championing good causes on your behalf, and he's taken the lead on so many important issues in the Parliament. So Keith, thank you for the leadership you've shown, mate. I've been asked today to share some perspectives on the Australian political system and I think allow you to reflect upon how they could be adopted in any future democratic movement in Iran, and ultimately more than a movement, but a real democracy in Iran. And in reflecting on what I would say today, I thought it's good to do a bit of a stock take of the Australian political system, imperfect though it is, but I think one of the best democracies in the world, and how it operates, and allow you to reflect upon how that could translate into Iran. We have broadly over the last 120 years had a very strong two-party system in this country. You're all aware of it. Labor, Liberal, the Liberal Party for the last nearly 80 years, which has broadly reflected the centre-right position on politics, and the Labor Party, which has broadly speaking adopted the centre-left position in politics. That two-party system has to some extent been challenged in recent years with the rise of third parties like the Greens on the left flank of the Labor Party, from time to time on the right flank of the Liberal Party with whether it's One Nation or the United Australia Party, and there's been a succession of parties over the years. And then more recently in the last election, and I think the last few elections, to be frank, we've seen the movement away from the two parties into adopting more support for independence. But why has the two-party system basically worked in Australia? I think really successfully. It's worked because even though we vehemently disagree on often the way in which a particular outcome needs to get achieved, we actually rarely disagree on what the outcome should be. So whether it's economic growth and prosperity, we don't disagree on the fundamental objective. We disagree on how it's achieved. Whether it's the provision of health and education services, rarely do we disagree fundamentally on what the broad objective should be. We just disagree on how it's achieved. Whether it's our emphasis, for example, in the Liberal Party on supporting entrepreneurialism, small business, people taking risks. How do you incentivise those risks? How do you have a more individually centric approach? And in reflecting on the challenges that I think for Iran in that context is, I think there's a very radical element within Iran who would not agree with many decent people on what the objective should be. And we're sort of seeing that a little bit in the United States at the moment. Our closest ally and greatest friend in many respects. But in the United States, I'm sure for those of you who are political junkies like me who watch these things, we're seeing an environment now where the Republicans and Democrats in the United States are not able to speak to each other as much. They seem to be more entrenched in their own camps. I think fortunately we haven't reached that point in Australia. For all the theatre and everything that you see in the Parliament and all of the conflict you see, more often than not, quietly behind the scenes, we will very happily, very warmly negotiate good outcomes on behalf of the country between the two major parties. Now, you don't typically see that. What you see is us arguing pretty forcefully in Parliament. And what underpins the ability for us to be able to sit down and negotiate good outcomes for the country is that we fundamentally have a shared set of values. And some of those values were outlined in the beginning of today's event. A commitment to democracy, a commitment to the rule of law, a commitment to freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion. Because we fundamentally agree on all those things, it's very easy for us to sit down as a Liberal Party and a Labor Party, or the National Party and the Labor Party, and actually negotiate good outcomes for our country. And I can promise you that negotiation happens all the way from the Prime Minister's office to the Leader of the Opposition's office, and that's been the case for many years. So I think the biggest challenge for Iran is, how do you enfranchise people for whom they don't necessarily agree, or they vehemently disagree with any movement towards democracy? I mean, if you cannot agree on that fundamental notion that rather than some theocracy, there should be democracy, I think it's very hard to have that kind of approach that we have in Australia. Now, I'm not trying to put a wet blanket over the possibility or the opportunity to do it, but I think that is going to be the greatest challenge or impediment for the movement in Iran. Now, we obviously have a huge interest in the movement towards democracy in Iran, because my view is the latent productive capacity of a highly educated, massive country, 90 million people, the economic and other benefits for the world, I think, are quite remarkable. And I think that very highly intelligent and sophisticated population is being held back quite massively at the moment. So every country in the world, just through self-interest, I think has should have a motivation to facilitate democracy in Iran, because I mean, I think the economic benefits for the world, let alone the decency and fairness and safety that will all of a sudden be there for a huge population, that's an important part of the picture. But if we're just looking at it from self-interest, and I think it's always good to appeal to people's self-interest, every nation in the world should be self-interested in democracy in Iran. So I see that as being the big challenge. How do you, for example, as a movement, reach across the aisle to people who aren't necessarily vehemently in support of democracy? How do you find middle ground with them? That's a question I don't have an answer for. I suspect that there will be parts of the regime in Iran that, to be frank, it's almost impossible to find that middle ground. But just reflecting on what has worked in Australia, it's a broad-based support for the fundamentals. And whilst we disagree on innumerable numbers of specific issues, we do come together on the basics. Now, I have no doubt that the movement towards democracy in Iran has widespread support amongst the population. How you enfranchise those people, particularly given the horrific consequences that can fall on individuals if they do, how you do that, I think, is going to be the secret of your movement. But even within the movement for democracy, I would just say, facilitate people with different strands of thinking. So even within your movement, you will have people who are more centre-left, some who are more centre-right. That's very healthy. You do not need to have a uniform view, provided you are someone who knows those people, particularly given the horrific consequences that can fall on individuals if they do. How you do that, I think, is going to be the secret of your movement. But even within the movement for democracy, I would just say, facilitate people with different strands of thinking. So even within your movement, you will have people who are more centre-left, some who are more centre-right. That's very healthy. You do not need to have a uniform view, provided you are someone who agrees with the fundamentals, which is democracy must come to Iran. And if you agree on that, I think having a great diversity of political thought is going to be a strength, because within that movement you will be able to build coalitions from places that that one part of your movement won't be able to. And I think in the end, much better thinkers on this issue than me, but my perspective is the ultimate success of your movement will be how many of those, for want of a better term, groups or strands of thinking within Iran, how many can you enfranchise and make them genuinely feel a part of the broader movement? And if you do that, and you've got a diversity of political thought, a diversity of views around the table, but all in agreement on the fundamentals, democracy, rule of law, then I think your movement is destined to succeed. Absolutely destined to succeed. So, look, that's a very broad summary, but I think in the end that central agreement on those core foundations, I think will be the only way forward for your movement, and the more you can do to appeal to the broadest possible segment of the Iranian population is going to be the success. Can I just say though, the work that the diaspora community is doing from Australia, I think is really extraordinary, and credit to you. I have a Lebanese background, and I grew up in a family that was similar to you. Well, back then we'd read the papers or watch SBS. There was no internet, and you would look at your home country with a great deal of despair, and you would watch it very closely, and there is a feeling of helplessness, a feeling of great concern for your relatives, or even if you don't have relatives, just your mother country. So I understand that for many of you, this is like a weight that sits there on your shoulders, because even though we enjoy the prosperity and safety of Australia, you never forget your home country. So I think what you're doing is really outstanding. I've been really watching the movement more closely over recent years. I think you can make a huge difference, and I think we're starting to see some of the benefits of that. So thank you for all the work you're doing. Thanks for the commitment and dedication, and I hope those very small insights have helped. Thanks very much.